Opening the center immediately offers dynamic possibilities and pawn pressure against black's nascent defenses. Instantly creating imbalanced pawn structures, this Sicilian defense opens a dynamic battleground. Developing the knight toward the center opens a path for queenside castling and pressures black's pawn structure. Solidifying central presence, this pawn advance prepares for rapid development and a robust defensive structure against white's aggressive opening. Challenging the center's grip, this pawn thrust immediately opens lines and forces black to make fundamental decisions about pawn structure. Opening the center with this exchange offers immediate clarity, surrendering central presence for active piece play. Opening the d-file for potential rook pressure, this recapture quickly centralizes the knight and pressures black's pawn structure. Developing the knight to f6 naturally contests the center and prepares castling, a classic response in this Sicilian setup. Anchoring the knight here fortifies the center and prepares for queenside expansion, while black ponders their next developmental step. Preparing to secure the queenside with a timely b5 advance, this prepares for expansion. Creating an escape route for the king, this move prophylactically prepares for potential pawn pushes or the advancement of black's pieces, while also preventing the knight from landing on the strategically inconvenient g4 square. It subtly supports the central pawn structure by not creating immediate weaknesses. Black aggressively seizes territory on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's central presence and prepare for future pawn advances like c5 or b4, potentially opening lines against the white king and gaining crucial queenside space. Boldly challenging the Sicilian's flank pawn structure, this knight leap aggressively targets black's queenside expansion by threatening to isolate the b5 pawn, forcing an immediate strategic response and potentially disrupting black's intended pawn storm. Actively developing the bishop to a square where it can eye the kingside and support a d5 pawn push. This is a logical reaction, aiming to contest the center and prepare for further piece activity. Opening a clear diagonal for the queen towards the kingside, this capture disrupts black's pawn structure and simplifies the position, potentially leading to an early advantage if black recaptures inaccurately. Opening the g-file so violently reshapes black's kingside pawn structure, creating inherent weaknesses that white can potentially exploit later on, especially since the dark-squared bishop is no longer defended. This aggressive capture, while removing an attacking knight, simultaneously exposes the monarch and relinquishes key central control for territorial gains on the queenside. Sharpens the pawn structure and fights for central control, aiming to restrict black's dark-squared bishop while creating attacking possibilities along the c-file. Opening a vital diagonal for white's bishop and simultaneously creating structural weaknesses around black's king are the immediate consequences of this capture, potentially sacrificing piece activity for material. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop immediately addresses the doubled pawn on the f-file by opening a diagonal and increasing pressure towards black's king. Embracing material at the cost of immediate king safety is a bold gamble, potentially opening the door to a fierce queenside initiative if white can't quickly coordinate their forces. The king's safety is paramount, and castling now shields the monarch from potential central pawn storms and immediate threats on the queenside, while simultaneously activating the rook for future action along the open d-file. The central pawns are now locked in a tense embrace, and black's audacious capture has opened a vital diagonal for their bishop, while simultaneously creating a pawn structure that will need careful attention later. Reclaiming the e-file asserts vital central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances, simultaneously offering some protection to the king. Pushing the pawn to e5 initiates a dynamic pawn struggle, aiming to seize central space and disrupt white's piece development, though it opens the d-file for potential counterplay and might strain black's king's safety if not handled with care. Unleashing a queenly sortie, white aims to exploit the awkward placement of black's beleaguered king and the compromised pawn structure on the kingside. This aggressive maneuver forces a response, potentially disrupting black's pieces and opening lines of attack. Recognizing the immediate threat on the queen, black correctly interposes the knight, developing a piece while simultaneously creating a shield and opening a pathway for the king to potentially escape the center's pressure. This knight's journey from f6 to d7, though seemingly a retreat, is a crucial tactical geometry maneuver to shore up the queenside and prepare for potential counterplay. Sacrificing material to open critical lines for your attacking pieces often hinges on the follow-up. Here, white prioritizes the newly activated dark-squared bishop and the potential pressure along the now open e-file, aiming to disrupt black's king's safety before the material disadvantage becomes overwhelming. This captured pawn suddenly opens a diagonal for black's bishop, potentially creating immediate threats against the white king, and simultaneously frees up black's position, allowing for more fluid piece development. Launching a daring knight to f5 immediately challenges the enemy monarch's safety, creating a prickly outpost and hinting at a potential kingside onslaught, while simultaneously disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially isolating their queen. A courageous reclamation of central space, this maneuver sacrifices pawn material to open lines and activate the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's kingside safety and potentially liberate the trapped knight on d7. Unleashing a daring knight sacrifice that rips open the king's defenses, forging a path towards a swift checkmate by exploiting the weakened dark squares around the black monarch. A desperate attempt to untangle from the sticky web, sacrificing tempo and piece coordination for a sliver of defensive hope. The knight's sudden plunge to f5 initiates a decisive tactical sequence, aiming to expose the black king and exploit the strained pawn structure. White's intent is to force a checkmate or a significant material gain by creating immediate threats against the enemy monarch, while simultaneously disrupting black's defensive coordination. A crucial moment where the king, having flirted with danger, now retreats to a slightly less exposed square, attempting to consolidate its position amidst the chaotic board, though the lingering pressure on the light squares from white's queen suggests a temporary reprieve at best. A subtle development, this bishop retreat shores up the a2-g8 diagonal and prepares to contest the open d-file, aiming to disrupt black's king's safety by potentially swinging to the kingside later if an opportunity arises. Opening the e-file with this capture initiates a crucial pawn exchange that aims to disrupt white's kingside harmony and potentially expose their monarch. Opening the f-file with this pawn push irrevocably alters the structural landscape, creating a permanent weakness on e3, while simultaneously offering the potential for decisive pressure against black's compromised king. This move injects significant dynamism into the queenside, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and disrupt white's coordination by creating an immediate threat to the c3 knight. The rook's redeployment to the d-file aims to contest central control, potentially forcing a liquidation that could alleviate black's queenside space advantage while preparing to exploit any weaknesses that emerge. This move positions the rook on the 7th rank, a crucial outpost to pressure white's doubled pawns on the f and e files, while simultaneously preparing to contest the file. Asserting dominion over the d-file with the rook now brings immense pressure, potentially forcing black's king into an even more exposed position or creating unavoidable material concessions. Relinquishing control of the central d5 square for an isolated pawn structure on the kingside, and a potentially vulnerable king feels like a significant positional concession, especially with white poised to exploit the open files. White seeks to intensify pressure on the queen side, utilizing the queen's influence to potentially exploit black's slightly exposed king and create new avenues of attack. Sensing a potential defensive weakness, black endeavors to consolidate their piece placement, aiming to shield their monarch from immediate threats while simultaneously preparing for future counterplay along the central files. Unleashing a devastating tactic, white abruptly sacrifices the bishop to expose black's monarch to a swift and brutal attack, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure around the king and open lines for immediate assault. Relocating the monarch to d8, black seeks to extricate the king from immediate tactical crossfire, a necessary step given the exposed position after white's aggressive bishop sacrifice. This maneuver aims to consolidate the beleaguered forces and prepare for potential defensive coordination, although the king remains a focal point of white's attacking potential. A decisive blow aiming to shatter black's already compromised king's safety. This move initiates a calculated pressure on the d-file that white is determined to exploit with every available piece.